If you've been deep in this SSI, decentralized identity, digital identity realm, a bit basic, but what we've learned is it's necessary, especially for folks we're talking to and discussing business. They want to understand why and what is the difference between, the marketplace that they're operating in and why and how they could operate in ecosystems and where it's different. So one of the things we've been talking about, we've been saying about Ayra, we've been created to connect these digital trust ecosystems. We've been using the phrase that Ayra is providing a thin layer on the business, on the governance, on the technology front. But what does that mean? And we had to get a little bit more concrete. And this actually started to address in our earlier session. We did this session 12 hours ago with some of our members who had raised concerns about where are we competitive? Where were they thinking we may be competitive? But the whole thing of our ecosystems we're operating in, there's many different ecosystems we're living in. We have government ID, we have education, workforce credentials. These are all just places where our members are active. Health, finance, worker mobility. Worker mobility touches and draws upon so many other ecosystems in order to accomplish its job. Travel, insurance. This is kind of the life around you, the individual, around people. But then we get into trade, supply chain, organization ID. And we have all of these ecosystems that are touching upon each other. They need information from different places. And really, each of those ecosystems on the screen is really a set of ecosystems inside itself. Organization ID is, there's different organization IDs in every country on the planet. And each country has its own kind of unique way of doing things, ranging from corporations to in Canada, US, I think we use the term sole proprietorship. We have sole traders in else places, and who knows what the names of these and the legal structures are. They're very different. Backing up, though, we keep talking about this thing called the trust triangle. The idea being that I can issue you something, data providers can issue to a holder a credential, and then later I can consume it, I can verify it. So we use an example, I could give you a driver's license and you can present it later to prove that you're licensed to drive or to prove that you're old enough to buy a product that has an age restriction. And technically, what we can do is say, hey, I was just presented with this driver's license from Maxwell. I can confirm cryptographically that he holds it. It's current. I can confirm that it has been signed by the issuer and it has not been revoked. But that's not sufficient. Governance is required to answer a question that tells me, hey, is that really Max happens to be from British Columbia? Is that really the British Columbia government that issued that credential? Or is it a high school kid selling fake driver's licenses so his friends can buy beer? In order to solve that problem, you can't solve that technically without governance. You have to have the governance side. Many different governance frameworks exist and many approaches. You may want to limit who the issuers are in your system, who's allowed to verify, what they're allowed to ask for, what wallets, vaults, what other tools are in your ecosystem. But that's a governance piece. What we've been talking to everybody about the ecosystems we're working in and the reason that we believe that the ecosystem of ecosystems approach is far, far better than creating silos. It's important to understand, though, ecosystems are leading themselves. They remain sovereign. We're not asking them to change a lot. They govern themselves, but they also need to run a trust registry, which is a small amount of tech. Um, if somebody already knows how their operations are, how they're going to govern their business rules, they've probably done 98+% of the work that's necessary. There's a tiny amount of work necessary to put a trust registry in front of a system, or if they're building one, they just attach a trust registry. It's important to understand that that's where they would limit or decide, who can issue what in an ecosystem, who can verify, what other pieces of information do we need in order to connect to it. It's also important to understand that trust registry is valuable to the ecosystem itself. As people start to manage their own ecosystem, it becomes a lot easier to do things when you're not looking up config files and not knowing where to get things. It just becomes a lot easier with a trust registry. It's important for us to understand that Ayra itself, we are an ecosystem. We lead the Ayra ecosystem, the Ayra Trust Network. We govern ourselves. We also run a trust registry. The job of our trust registry is principally to connect to other trust registries. Our job is to encourage and link other ecosystems into this overall Ayra trust network. It's important to understand that while we do that, each ecosystem is going to evolve independently. They're going to do their own things. Ayra doesn't impose much on their ecosystem. What we do is enable a few things, but we don't put much overhead. We're very, from a business governance and tech perspective, it's a very small amount of work. I just noticed we have a chat came in there. Just see something here from Glenn. Yep, that's a great comment. Glenn has pointed out there's multiple ecosystems. I'm going to show that in actually just a second. Um, and David has pointed out, I think that will benefit from examples that cut across types of credentials, not just identity. Business transactions typically involve identity, money, and some form of object. Showing how all three interact, it makes it easier to conceive. That's a good one. And I'm not sure I'll have an answer for that one right now, Dave. So one of the goals we have here is this sort of general fabric of two things we've been talking about a lot. One is the trust registry, and I'm going to get into the conformance test suite in a moment. And really, it's about how do we connect the Ayra Trust Network, create a fabric of ecosystems that are connecting, and what's necessary. So every ecosystem that wants to be part of the Ayra Trust Network needs to run a trust registry, because this thing tells people, it tells others who they can do business with, who's authorized to do what, and what are the rules of that particular ecosystem. It also establishes a linkage to the Ayra Trust Network. The way that link is done is actually our trust registries recognize each other. We would, go through the process, bring an ecosystem into the Ayra Trust Network, and they would connect, and then they're now, still in charge of their own ecosystem. The other goal we have, though, is also to make consuming data consistent. We need to know that the connections are going to work when I try to do something. The goal being that any wallet can connect to any data consumer. This is where our Ayra Conformance Test Suite comes in. This is the goal of connecting a wallet to a data consumer. This is actually active in many ecosystems, have many different wallets. They have many different players, and they want to make sure things are working. So they're actually looking forward to, and we're working with some of our members right now on getting them access to the Conformance Test Suite so they can start testing their own internal ecosystem linkage. But when we start to unlock things is when we have a consumer who's outside of that ecosystem. Someone who wants to actually make sure that they can get data from another ecosystem because they just need a little bit of information, don't need to join the ecosystem fully, but they want to unlock some of the value in that ecosystem. Excuse me. So if we look at how the ecosystems play, we know that there are many different member ecosystems out there. And that we want to bring them together into the Ayra Trust Network. The Ayra Association, our job is to govern that Ayra Trust Network. One of the things we're doing is we're running a trust registry, a registry of registries. We're just doing that on a sandbox basis right now. We're going to have a buy versus build. This is one of the things that we discussed this morning on what is that going to be when we need to go live on it. Are we going to buy one or are we going to just build a simple registry of registries? Because our functionality is just a little bit different. But the goal of that registry is, the purpose of it is to connect to other trust registries. That's so we understand who's out there. Who's out there, which ecosystem is available, and what signals can they say and send about who's authorized to do what in their ecosystems. But we also want to connect in between. Ayra doesn't get involved when you go from one ecosystem to another, when you're sharing information from one entity to another. We don't get involved in that, but we all want to make sure it works. We want to make sure that the connection is there. We set the conditions by which those connections happen, but we don't get involved in the actual connection and sharing of information. This is where the conformance test suite comes in, to make sure that we understand how things are going to move across the wire so that they're consistent. And that's really our story on the trust registries and what we call conformant exchange.